Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. I've wanted to have more conversations about the American presidency for a long time. Considering that it's an election year, I especially think it's important that we take a bit of a break from the weekly policy focus of the show and focus on how specific individuals have stepped up to the plate and met their own political moments. For today's conversation, then, I'm joined by Edward F. O'Keefe. He is the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation, and we're discussing his new book, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, which looks at the formation of the character and the individual we know as Theodore Roosevelt through the lens of the women in his life, his two wives, his daughter, his sisters, and of course, his mother. This is a great conversation. I know folks like when we shout out books, so there are plenty of great Theodore Roosevelt books you could look forward to. And you should definitely let me know which other presidents and historical moments would be worth covering leading into the 2024 election. Hope you all enjoy this conversation, and a huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Edward O'Keefe, welcome to the Realignment.
It's great to be with you, Marshall.
Really excited to chat with you on 15 different levels. I was going to start by asking you the question of, when it comes to ranking America's presidents, how high do you rank Theodore Roosevelt? But after reading the book, I kind of thought of a more interesting question that actually reflects my reaction to The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, which is, I would wager that Theodore Roosevelt is the most interesting American president at a personal level. I'm looking back on my bookshelf here. I have books about Theodore Roosevelt and the American athlete. I read a book about Theodore Roosevelt in the occupation of the Philippines, Honor in the Dust. There's The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, T.R. the Last Romantic. I cannot imagine a president that people would be so interested in delving into all different aspects of his life that you could actually have not a cottage industry, because these are serious books, but just these niche books that still sell well and drive engaging audiences. So what do you think about the idea that he is the most interesting American president?
I don't think it's not even a close contest. I mean, what's interesting about Theodore Roosevelt is that what he did outside of the White House is more compelling than perhaps even what he did in the White House. I mean, the River of Doubt, the African expedition is a third party run. I mean, he has so many adventures in his lifetime that he's just, if you submitted the story of Theodore Roosevelt as a fictional character, it would get rejected. They'd be like, all right, come on. I mean, we're going to go down the River of Doubt after the presidency. The former president is going to nearly die and say, leave my bones in South America. It's incredible. I mean, incredible life story.
Yeah, to your description of that, he kind of reads as this 19th century adventure figure that we would kind of put in the same category as like a Horatio Alger story. But it actually is just his unique story. So then actually, that is a perfect pivot to, I think, the really vital contribution that you're bringing with this book, looking at Theodore Roosevelt through the eyes and relationships he had with the women that he loved. Also, like at a familial level, like not merely just romantically. There's a way we can tell the story of Theodore Roosevelt that's primarily about his sheer inhuman will. I think that's actually why I find him to be such a compelling figure. I actually started reading Edmund Morris's The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt during, frankly, like a tough period of my life. And more than any other biography, his story kind of being about, here is this person who could have all these challenges and then just use his human will to surmount them, was, I think, something that resonated with me, but a lot of other folks. But your key contribution here is that we can tell that story of his inhuman will, but also remember he didn't do this all just himself. I'd love you to kind of expand on that kind of dichotomy that you're bringing out here.
Well, the story I grew up with, Marshall, is the one that's sitting right behind you, right? The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, which is a very deservedly Pulitzer Prize winning, incredibly narrative, compelling book. And it really does frame Theodore Roosevelt as a self-made man. Of course, his two sisters, his two wives, and his mother are present in all of the previous canon, but they're not main characters. It's always sort of written that Theodore Roosevelt did it all himself. And I don't think it diminishes the role of Theodore Roosevelt to know that he didn't do it alone. I mean, all of us have mothers, brothers, sisters, colleagues, friends, grandparents, somebody, hopefully, if we're fortunate, in our life that picks us up and propels us forward when we're falling back or falling down. And that's what Theodore Roosevelt had. I mean, I love the story of Theodore Roosevelt, the self-made man, but it's a myth, and it's just it's an even more compelling story to know the folks that he had in his life that picked him up so repeatedly. Marshall, I hear that more often than you know. I'm also the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation. We're in the process of constructing the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in Medora, North Dakota. And, that is it's right alongside the only park named for a person, let alone a president. And people go there for solace and respite, to recover in nature like Theodore Roosevelt did, to find the will and the resilience to move forward after a setback or a hardship in their life. And I think that that's the biggest contribution that Theodore Roosevelt has to our culture, is that he's this example of always moving forward in the face of the inevitable problems you will face and challenges you'll face in life.
I want to kind of ruminate with you for a second around the idea of what self-made even means, because I think people think of self-made and busting myths around the self-made man as being about wealth or status or nepo babyism, which is kind of the modern Gen Z equivalent of it. What's interesting about Theodore Roosevelt is, on the one hand, you could say, yes, he comes from a very wealthy family. He's very much a member of the late 19th century privileged class. But at a deeper level, though, I think Theodore Roosevelt is a self-made man, in that more than I think most figures of public note, especially today, you see a person who, and once again, this is where his will comes in, is able to reshape both his conception of himself to almost like an inhuman level. We're going to keep resorting to that cliche during this conversation, because he's a person who says, okay, among my class, we typically don't engage in politics. I'm going to actually do that. Okay, I'm a skinny weakling with a bad, radio voice. Not that radio was the technology then, but you got the point. I'm going to revitalize and reconceptualize myself along those terms. I'm going to be an ornithologist. I'm going to be a scientist. No, I'm going to be a historian. I'm going to become a serious figure of the U.S. Naval War of 1812, that part of the conflict. And then he's going to become a Western kind of cowboy rancher. Talk about that self-made conception of Theodore Roosevelt that really matters.
Well, Marshall, you said it's a Horatio Alger story, and in a way, it's kind of the inverse, right? Because he doesn't have the story of Lincoln coming from nothing and self-taught and, rising through the challenges of life to this exalted position of the presidency. As you say, he starts life with a silver spoon in his mouth, right? He's got all the advantages in the world. But what's interesting about Theodore Roosevelt is he doesn't take that for granted. He goes out and he meets people who are unlike him. He listens to people, particularly women. I mean, what I talk about in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt is that, where did he learn that example? He learned that example from his older sister, Bammy. Bammy, only 3 years older, almost acts like a substitute mother to him. And, she's the one who's born with a spinal defect that's so debilitating. Her grandmother notes that Bammy can hardly stand for 30 seconds without the countenance of pain coming across her face. So it was from his older sister that Theodore Roosevelt is learning the example to will through pain. His father embraces this notion of muscular Christianity, a sound mind and a sound body. You actually begin in this era to see depictions of Jesus being beefier, larger. It's the birth of the, YMCA, and your podcast, the Realignment, right? Is the country is moving from an agrarian to an industrial society. The elite in this world need to find new ways to prove their worth, right? It becomes physical feats and strenuous activity that become associated with manliness. And Theodore Roosevelt, I say in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt that he's arguably the most masculine president in the American memory. And the big surprise is that he was actually created and informed by these extraordinary women.
I think what's interesting, and you kind of not just hint at this, you get into this, you're saying here that women played a role in that conception and building them into this masculine figure. But obviously, if you're reading The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, if you're reading Mornings on Horseback by the recently Well, actually, Edmund Morris and David McCullough did both recently pass away. I want to give them a quick shout out because they're really sort of the best introductions to him as a figure. They focus on his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., as this core conception of how he became so masculine. Like the famous story of when Theodore Roosevelt, when he's 12, he's asthmatic, he's skinny, he's sort of getting shoved around and bullied on the train. He goes to his father, and his father says, Theodore, you have the mind, but you don't have the body. And then Theodore Roosevelt, in his reedy 12-year-old voice, says, like, I'll build my body. And once again, that's I think, a really exciting and invigorating story that I think everyone, regardless of their class status, can really embrace. How are you kind of revising that Theodore Roosevelt Sr. centric version of his masculine journey?
Well, Marshall, the whole reason we know that story is because of his sister, Connie, his younger sister. She wrote a memoir, My Brother Theodore Roosevelt, after his passing, and was responsible for really framing the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt in the first years after his death. So it's interesting that a woman, his sister, told that story, and that's why we even know it. And Edmund Morris and David McCullough were able to write it when they did. And I'm able to write it in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Where I differ a bit is I think two things can be true at the same time. I think you can have a great father, as Theodore Roosevelt did, and certainly Thee was an extraordinary father. I mean, he's the co-founder of the American Museum of Natural History, one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He founds an orthopedic hospital, the first of its kind in New York City, because of Bammy, Theodore's older sister's spinal defect. He's a wonderful man. But what's happening is Mittie, his mother, is really the source of Theodore Roosevelt's personality. She's lively and vivacious. She's got these coy turns of phrase. She introduces Theodore to the McGuffey readers that have these clever phrases like the African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick, or nervous Nellies, right? What I think you could actually look at Theodore Roosevelt's uncle, Mittie's brother-in-law. She said of the relationship between Mittie and Thee, between your liveliness and his solemnity, you make an even pair. It's the old cliche, opposites attract. Mittie is the one who soothes every fever and every racking cough. She's literally massaging the blood out of the young Theodore Roosevelt's body. His father is putting cigar smoke in his face and taking him on midnight carriage rides. That's not how you treat asthma, right? I mean, his mother is the one, and this contra women, his grandmother, his aunt, they're all there while Thee is away at the Civil War. Now, he's not fighting for the Union, of course, because it's been forbidden in the household, but he's away working with Lincoln on the allotment system, trying to get pay back to soldiers at home. And so it's Mittie. It's always Mittie who's there taking care of him. And I think when you Marshall, you talk about that quote when TR was 12 years old and his father challenging him to make his body as well as his mind. I think, in a way, Theodore then rejected his mother. He didn't want to be mothered. He didn't want to be coddled. It's a very natural adolescent feeling to, reject those notions as you try to form your own identity in adolescence and eventually manhood. And then Thee tragically dies when TR is 20 years old. So this great man was great in life. In death, he becomes a saintly-like figure. He takes on even more importance in the memory of Theodore.
Yeah, and speaking of Theodore Roosevelt Sr.'s death, he really does die in his prime. He's quite young. It's one of those, and sure you, in your deep research for this book and just your work in general, come across figures like this. There are just so many figures like him where you think, like, man, if not for an early death, if not for events going different circumstances, you could have been a famous, impressive figure of the 19th and even 20th century, because he's still that young when he passes away. So a question for you here would be, because once again, folks probably aren't well read into Theodore Roosevelt Sr. I would love for you to kind of explain the importance of the Civil War allotment post, because what's interesting is that and others this, but there was a practice as the U.S. was still putting together how it handled its lack of a standing army, of like, if you were wealthy, you could buy your way out of the draft, out of having to serve. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. is not a coward when he does that, it's driven by the fact that his family was so Southern in a way. It's driven by like that dynamic. And then he goes on and he'll explain what he actually went on to do during the Civil War, probably like the highest rate of operational cowardice to actual real world impact that I've ever heard of in a historical figure. But Theodore Roosevelt himself clearly in his bloodlust, in his actions during the Spanish-American War is driven by that image of the Civil War. Talk about this dynamic.
Well, I think it's fascinating, Marshall. During the research for the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I found, fortunately, due to Greg Wynn, the president of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, opening a safe that hadn't been opened since 1954, 11 letters that were never available to McCullough or Morris. They're in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt for the first time. And included in those 11 letters is an extraordinary letter from Theodore Roosevelt's father to a 3-year-old TR. So obviously he couldn't read at this point, but the letter comes from the White House. It's from his father, dated December 31st, 1861. So the Civil War has just started. And he says in this extraordinary letter, "I have just come from the president's house. He governs the whole country." I mean, now let's just stop there for a second. Wow. You have, he's describing the White House to his son, who will become president of the United States. He says, "I've just met with President Lincoln, and I've come by this statue that stands outside the White House. I want your mother to read for you what it says and learn it by heart, so when I get home, you can repeat it to me." And the statue is of Andrew Jackson. It still stands outside the White House to this day. And it says, "The federal union, it must be preserved." So interesting, right? Fee's needling, his Southern wife, Mitty is from Georgia. She has left to marry Fee, and then her sister and her mother have followed. So they're living in New York with him. What I find fascinating about that—
And one quick detail, her two brothers are notorious Confederate privateers. So like to the point where they actually can't return to the United States after the Civil War, they're that notorious. So this isn't just a typical, like this is the furthest extent of what that Southern relationship would be.
I mean, so notorious, as you said, not allowed to return, not granted amnesty. And one of her brothers on his gravestone in Liverpool will say, "An American by birth, an Englishman by choice." I mean, he took that to his grave. Their deeds were so dastardly that they were not granted amnesty and are kind of an amazing, incredible, crazy story in and of themselves. But
can I pause you real quick? Because I was actually wondering this, reading the book. Has anyone looked up what happened to the Bullock descendants? So like that's her last name. So like I was just always, when I'm reading that anecdote in the book, I'm just imagining there was just a couple, British, very, very British by this point, obviously, people in my age cohort kind of running around, like not quite maybe they do understand, but what happened to the Bullock descendants in England?
There are books about the Bullock descendants, James and Irving. One was basically in charge of the Confederate system of smuggling ships through the blockade. So getting supplies from the UK to the CSA, to the Confederate States of America. I mean, without those supplies, they couldn't fight the Civil War. I mean, that was what it was, a very critical position. And another was thought to have shot the last shot on of the SS Alabama, CSA Alabama, one of the most notorious battleships of the war. I mean, so they were active participants in the war, and then they both are living in Liverpool after the Civil War. And so Mitty, who's had 4 children in 6 years, lost contact with 2 brothers. Part of the reason that the Roosevelt family goes to Europe for that first grand tour is so she can see her brothers again. And of course, Theodore's hearing these stories of their not heroics, obviously. I mean, they were fighting for the wrong side of the war, but she's hearing these stories of their experiences in battle. And I'm sure it left an incredibly indelible impression. And it's interesting then to fast forward that, as you said, Marshall, Theodore Roosevelt fights in the Spanish-American War, which is really the first time that that blue and gray become red, white, and blue again. That is a unifying kind of rallying experience. The military is so, I mean, I think Clay Risen wrote a wonderful book about the crowded hour, the Rough Rider, the battle in Spanish and Cuba. And, I think the military is down to 28,000 at that point. I mean, there's war fever, of course, in the Civil War. Then, just like every other war experience, people want to diminish the capacity of the military after that horrific experience. So the volunteers that come together, they are, in a sense, unifying. And that, I think, was a formative experience. Theodore Roosevelt grows up in a house divided, in a nation divided. He watches and witnesses his mother and father disagree without being disagreeable. They love one another. They differ on this incredibly profound political issue of moral and ethical importance to the United States. And yet they stay together and they prosper together after the war. And I think, that informed his viewpoint as well.
My favorite story that gets to how the Spanish-American War quite literally restitched together the country is, I forget the name of the general, but often many of the generals who were leading American troops had fought in the Civil War. And one of the leading generals was a former Confederate. And when they were either taking San Juan Hill or during one of the different battles, he was chanting, because they were all sort of old at that point, just chanting, "We've got the Yankees on the run." That really just illustrates how visceral that still was, and how, and once again, Spanish-American War, obviously the USS Maine wasn't actually detonated by the Spanish. So I'm not saying this isn't quite the way that you would want the country to reunify together, but it just speaks to how different of a period we're speaking about here. So something that you've done a really great job of doing in this book is really you've contributed serious additional research. Anyone who's read the Theodore Roosevelt canon will find themselves reading your book saying, "Oh, I didn't know that's new." You have all these cool photographs I've never seen before. You have all these cool, once again, to your point about letters, but you also do a great job of citing, I think, your predecessors who've done a great job: Kathleen Dalton, Edmund Morris, David McCullough, obviously. Could you give me and the listenership, because we love to do books here, you don't have to rank them perfectly, but what are the top 5, or what are the Theodore Roosevelt books that come to mind that you enjoy? Because you've clearly done the canon here as part of this process.
That's a great question, Marshall, and one I haven't been asked on this book tour for the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Obviously, I hope the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt joins the top 5 and that your listeners will enjoy it. But for my money, Dr. Kathleen Dalton's A Strenuous Life, which was published in 2001, is the single greatest single volume biography of Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, I recommend it all the time. I cite it voluminously in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Kathy and I had a really interesting, she was so generous, so kind. She invited me into her home. She shared her research with me, which became essential when the pandemic restricted my ability to go and continue my research wherever Theodore Roosevelt's papers were. And, I asked Kathy, why weren't readers ready to understand Theodore Roosevelt and the people and the women around him? And she said, without hesitation, time. The people weren't ready to understand Theodore Roosevelt as anything but the product of his own will. So you will certainly see in Kathy's book, A Strenuous Life, discussions of his more progressive viewpoints, discussions of the women and the others in his life that he's listening to. You see an extraordinary discussion of Theodore Roosevelt's evolution on race. I mean, the fact that the final speech that Theodore Roosevelt ever gives in his life, November 2nd, 1918, is it's at Carnegie Hall, W.E.B. Du Bois on stage, mixed race audience, which he often spoke to mixed race audiences. And he says that he gives a full-fledged support for equal rights for Black and white in America, such that had he been elected president in 1920, he could have stuck a knife in the heart of Jim Crow 45 years before the Civil Rights Act. I mean, Felix Frankfurter, the famed Supreme Court justice, will say that Theodore Roosevelt said this country will not be complete until we have a Black president and we have a Jewish president. That's a viewpoint you don't often hear when discussing Theodore Roosevelt. Kathy brings that to light. I'd say very quickly, obviously, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt and the entire trilogy by Edmund Morris, Mornings on Horseback by David McCullough. I'd add Betty Caroli's The Roosevelt Women, which is vignettes of all the Roosevelt women across both the Hyde Park and the Oyster Bay line and down the descendancy. I'm obviously focusing on the 5 women in the immediate atmosphere of Theodore Roosevelt. But Betty's book is extraordinary as well. I mentioned Clay Risen's book, the Crowded Hour. I mean, Stacey Cordery's book on Alice is phenomenal. Obviously, Sylvia Morris's book, which is still sadly the only single volume biography of Edith, is quite wonderful. I mean, I could go on and on and on.
Edith being his second wife for folks. No, here's something. I just want to shout out a couple of the books you cited here. So The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt is part of Edmund Morrison's 3-part, telling of the story. I think The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt has the greatest opening chapter of any book I've ever read. And by that, I mean that very literally. It doesn't start, bio, Theodore Roosevelt is born X. It actually just starts with Theodore Roosevelt in his prime, speaking back to his father. It's New Year's after he's been elected in his own right. The last time the White House is opened up to the public. It used to be this old tradition where if you could make it to the White House, after all of the royalty and the diplomats got to go, like normal people got to go. And he actually technically broke like the world record for like the number of like handshakes in an hour at the time. But funnily enough, I remember reading McKinley's bio. McKinley had the previous world record. So that's one of those operationally, if we continued this practice, it seems as if any president who in a contained space was going to achieve this one. So I would say that's one of his more mild by default accomplishments. But it just talks about his day. This crazy. And then at 10 o'clock, he says, and then Theodore Roosevelt sat down and read a book. And I just remember reading that, and I was sort of like, oh my God. And then it goes to the start, because the story there is basically, how did this incredible man, how was he produced? And then secondly, Mornings on Horseback, which I think is definitely, it's a tiny bit of a harder read than The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. What I love about it is McCullough, so it came out in 1979. He identifies a fascinating idea, which is the book is Theodore Roosevelt ages 0 to 28. And the conception is, I was fascinated by the question of not, hey, Theodore Roosevelt is the Ubermensch, this, or that. It's how did he become that person? What was he before the Theodore Roosevelt that we have in our mind? How did he come about? I think that's just a fascinating conception. And this is what makes Theodore Roosevelt unique. And I'll stop ranting about my excitement about this person in this space. There are very few presidents who I think we could write interesting books about from the ages of 0 to 28. That's what I think is so fascinating.
Exactly. Well, I will say, who was standing next to Theodore Roosevelt as he broke the record for this number of single handshakes? His sisters, right? Connie and Bammy and Edith, his wife, are there alongside him, shaking those hands along with TR. Bammy's home in Washington, D.C. was known as the Little White House. I mean, he would take walks out of the White House and go sit with T and strategize every major decision with Bammy, who was really kind of like what Robert F. Kennedy was to John F. Kennedy, Bammy was to Theodore Roosevelt. They obscured their roles. And I think Edmund Morris's book is so lyrically beautiful, just wonderfully written. It's so easy to read. But I discussed this with Edmund before he sadly passed way too young. What wasn't available to Edmund when he wrote his book, or to McCullough when he wrote Mornings on Horseback, were these 24 letters between Theodore and Alice to really flesh out the love story of what their relationship actually meant. I mean, and Morris is a little bit cruel to Alice, his first wife, in which he essentially argues the greatest service that he ever did her was to leave her. Where I disagree. I mean, I put out in the,
to be clear for folks, you don't mean she dies. So it's not that he left her. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he basically says the greatest service that she did was die, and then he could, bury his childhood and adolescence with her and move on to this life of greatness. In the 4 years that Theodore Roosevelt and Alice Hathaway Lee are married, in TR's own words, he rose like a rocket. He wrote the Naval War of 1812. He's elected the youngest member of the New York State Assembly. He doesn't complete law school, the one thing he only quits in his whole life. But, he's had tremendous success. And they're exchanging these letters talking about the ideas that will later inform his philosophy. So, and then in McCullough, I think what's interesting about his book is he likes Mitty more than most biographers. He seems to give credit to Mitty more so than others, particularly Morris. Interesting that they were both doing their books around the exact same time and then came out within 3 years of one another. The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt really sees Mitty, his sisters, and his wives as much more consequential to his success than probably either of those books argues.
And, to your point about Edith being next to him and being with him, obviously, during that famous New Year's scene, you said the point that Edmund Morris's books are so lyrical. It's been years since I've read it, but I remember these lines. You point out that Edith was the first modern first lady. I'd love for you to talk about this. But critically, I remember the line from Edwin Morris. She purged the White House of Victorian bric-a-brac. I don't know what bric-a-brac is technically, but like ever since I listened to it on Audible in 2011, I just loved that sentence. So talk about the White House used to be stuffy, bric-a-bracy, whatever that means. Talk about like the role that she played as the first modern first lady.
So Edith is probably one of the most consequential first ladies in history. My good friend Cokie Roberts, who also sadly passed away not too long ago and too young, was the Dianist, the expert on first ladies. So I wish she were here to verify and validate my statement. But, Edith, as I say, she's the first modern first lady. She comes into the White House and she makes it her own. First of all, it is bric-a-brac. It is not a stately mansion. It is really commensurate with the power of the executive branch of government. So she understands that she has to physically redesign the White House to create a government center and a residential component. And she designs the White House. It'll eventually be the East Wing, the West Wing. They renamed the White House from the Executive Mansion to the White House. That's how in touch they were with kind of how plain, common, populist speech was. I mean, she's the first person to hire a social secretary, something that every single successor to Edith will do. She is reading 4 to 5 newspapers a day and briefing Theodore on the news that he needs to know. She's known as a better judge of character. I mean, Theodore will say, whenever I go against Edith's judgment, I regret it. And contemporaries will agree. Henry Stimson, who just had a revival in the Oppenheimer book and the Oppenheimer movie, he's in that famous scene.
By the way, I as a Henry Stimson person, I actually lived in Woodley Park when I lived in DC, and I lived right across from his mansion. So I'm a Henry Stimson person. I actually do not like. I understand the purpose of the scene where he says, Kyoto, I honeymooned there, but I think there's some really deep. Once again, it's not a movie about Stimson. There's so much context that you miss on Henry Stimson. You just see him as just sort of like an old white dude who's just dehumanizing towards Japanese people. But I have to just give people like a side bookmark. Read about Henry, though there aren't many Henry Stimson books. So that's researcher work on that.
Go down that rabbit hole. It's a worthy rabbit hole. I mean, he crosses so many different administrations and so many really important roles. And in Theodore Roosevelt's administration, it's Stimson who observes of Edith that she is the better judge of character, that she is the one who soothes his tempestuous nature. He's very impulsive and tends to make decisions without taking a look at the larger chessboard, the political dynamics at play. And Edith is the one who will say to Theodore before he runs in 1912, put it out of your mind, Theodore. You will never be president of the United States again. Ouch. But she's politically right. I mean, she knows this will probably not work and sees the kind of political situation more clearly than he does. I mean, and he's all instinct. He's all id. He's all go and action. And she's thoughtful. She's more reserved. She's more tactical. She's more strategic. And so there's these physical changes that she makes to the White House. There's these precedents that she sets in terms of, she starts the first salons that then will become famous with Jacqueline Kennedy. She begins the Colonial Garden that will become the Rose Garden. She has a transformative effect. And yet, as one of her Washington neighbors describes, Margaret Chandler, as soon as she comes into the view, she steps aside just as the camera is about to click, right? She doesn't want to be known. And that's what's so fascinating in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt is that each of these women, they actually intentionally obscured their role in history. They wanted everyone to believe that Theodore did it all himself.
Something I'd love to, I kind of like talk about you and the work you're doing at the Theodore Roosevelt Library. So it's why. So y'all are building this out in North Dakota. You could, of course, in your answer, explain like why the residence really matters here, and why you being from North Dakota actually matters there too. But why is relative to his popularity, his presence, et cetera, why has there not been a serious Roosevelt? I don't want to insult anybody, but Theodore Roosevelt, like I live in Austin, right? So the LBJ Museum. So LBJ is this obviously consequential president, but in terms of popularity and like public presence, he's much lower. Yet he has a library. Talk about what happened over the course of a 20th century that would have suggested you'd have an environment like that pop up.
Well, the technical answer is that the presidential library system didn't exist until FDR. And then Hoover, because he was still alive after FDR had built his library, then built his in West Branch, Iowa. So what happened in 1919, Theodore Roosevelt dies rather unexpectedly to the public. To his family, they knew he was sick, but to the public, they thought that he was going to be the president of the United States again. He was the leading candidate for the Republican nomination in
62 years old, right? Like very, very, very young for the time.
Sure. I mean, he turned 60 in October and he dies on January 6, 1919. So he's barely 60 years old. And so the nation is really struggling with how to memorialize. He wasn't assassinated, he wasn't slain, but he was gone too soon in the imagination of the American public. So they actually passed the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Association Act. And that begins this effort led by his sisters, Bammy and Connie in particular, and his widow, Edith, to cement TR's legacy through the preservation of the boyhood home in New York City, eventually this at his private home, Sagamore Hill, after Edith's death, becoming a national park site to this day. And, now, and there was an effort to build a memorial park in North Dakota. Because Theodore Roosevelt, we like to say, in the East, you feel the presence of Theodore Roosevelt's ghost. In the West, you feel the presence of Theodore Roosevelt's spirit. I talked before, earlier in the podcast, Marshall, when you go to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, you will inevitably meet somebody who's going through a divorce or has lost someone important in their life. They have had a health crisis. They've come to the place where TR lived for the better part of 2 years as a rancher and a cowboy. He used nature as his healer and classroom. And this place, it's almost spiritual. And we really feel like, your podcast is the Realignment, right? If you don't understand history, you're damned to repeat it. And history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, right? What existed in Theodore Roosevelt's time? You had a massive wave of immigration changing the composition of the country. You had new technologies really upending society. You had the transition of the economy from an agrarian to an industrial culture. You had the debate about what America's place is in the world. Are we isolationist, or are we going to actually have a say in the worldview and world affairs, right? All of this, Theodore Roosevelt kicks open the door to the American century because these women in the arena are helping him become the best that he can possibly be. And so we see the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library as not being about the past. It is about the future, and it's about you. It's about your place in the arena where you can make a difference in the world. Theodore Roosevelt's story is a fantastic story, but his legacy is cemented. What we want to do is use that story of Theodore Roosevelt to help inspire future generations to get through this moment of realignment and realize that a unified country and a democracy is worth fighting for. And I think Theodore Roosevelt, he's like a Rorschach test. What you see in him says more about you than it does about him. He's the only person I know that can unite, Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley, both of whom say Theodore Roosevelt is their favorite president. And so the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt is really an effort to remind people that this figure is more than just himself. He is the product of his family and his loved ones. And the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, I think, will be a place that we hope kids drag their parents, and that families can come together. They can go on a hike. They can go on a walk. They can go on horseback, because it'll be the only library you can ride a horse to. And you can really appreciate the place that saved Theodore Roosevelt's life.
And for those who aren't in the know, let's talk a bit about why North Dakota is so important to his story. I think this is sort of a throwaway line in Edmund Morris's book, I believe, but they just mention how, Theodore Roosevelt was so prominent in the North Dakota or the Dakota territories, then when there was talk of statehood, there was talk about him being the first senator who the legislature would select, which is kind of like a fascinating alternate history, but it's not actually much of an alternate history because I think he would have been a terrible senator. He was not constitutionally, he's not constitutionally suited for it. So talk about like all this side of the story. Like, why is North Dakota so central here?
Well, Theodore Roosevelt is living in North Dakota before it becomes a state. It's the Dakota Territory. It's literally the last stop on the train that you can buy. Can't go any further west at this point in American history. And he comes out there first. He talked briefly into eastern North Dakota with his brother Elliot on his bachelor party, essentially in 1880. He returns in 1883 to hunt a buffalo. He doesn't see the irony in hunting a buffalo as they're potentially going extinct, but he's there to hunt a buffalo. While he's there, he spends $14,000, half of his inheritance, on cattle. He's going to go into the cattle ranching business. And several of those letters that are new to the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt that were not available to Edmund Morris are a series of letters that he sent back to Alice from the Badlands explaining why he was making this investment in Dakota. So interestingly, before Alice died, Theodore really saw a connection between his life in the East and this new life and expansion of America in the West. And so, it was a place where he believed he could have a new identity. We talked about this, right? He's self-made and he's creating his new identity. He's not resting on his laurels as a member of the wealthiest echelon of society. He wants to live a harder life. He wants to challenge himself physically. He wants to meet people who are different than himself, and he wants to know the value of hard work. And boy, the life of a rancher today is hard work. The life of a rancher in the 1880s is extraordinarily difficult and challenging. And that's what he gets out west. He gets this experience in nature and challenging himself physically to do things that he would never be able to do in New York City.
Another Edmund Moore, and this is Theodore Roosevelt's line, but this is highlighted in the story. I know you know this one, but when they're illustrating how socially new he was to this space, he's with his ranchers and he says, "Hasten forward quickly there." When he's trying to tell them to go after. Once again, this is why I can't think of, it's been so long since I read this book, but just as you're telling the story, like I'm actually just like, man, I remember this line and this line and that line. So you're working within a good tradition. So, okay. So two last big questions here. So number one question, obviously the Roosevelts, especially the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, are not able to maintain this political greatness across generations. This also happens to the Hyde Park Roosevelts as well too. And actually Theodore Roosevelt, like junior. So I guess this would be like the third, I believe. So his son is a very interesting figure. He storms the beaches of Normandy and has a heart attack a few days later. So like, it's not as if he wasn't an impressive figure, but his political career was really a failure that was overshadowed by the success of Franklin Roosevelt. So I'm not meaning to be insulting to Theodore Roosevelt's descendants with this, but how did one family produce such impressive people? You point this out, like Bammy, the line about Bammy was, separate from her, birth defect, if she'd been a man, she would have been president because in certain ways she was more impressive than Theodore Roosevelt. Connie is just like a poet and a writer and such a thoughtful person. I think sometimes like when we do our like Kennedy worship thing, the Kennedys are very important, but we kind of have to like overdo it with how impressive any individual was. Like in this case, this family, even Elliot is such a fascinating, he's the Eleanor Roosevelt's father. Just what happened? Do you know what I mean? Like what happened in this like weird mix of, Dutch farmer Roosevelt and Sons and combined with the South that produced this one generation of such incredible people?
That's America, right? That's the gift and beauty of America. I think what I look at in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt that might differ from previous books is that I explore exactly what you just talked about, Marshall. That it is Theodore's daughter Alice that will observe had Bammy been a man, that she, not Theodore, would have been president of the United States. That's an extraordinary statement. And then in the 1950s, in an oral interview, Eleanor Roosevelt is asked about that statement, and Eleanor Roosevelt agrees. She agrees with that assessment. So, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt will say about Edith that she managed Theodore quite cleverly without his being conscious of it. No slight achievement anyone will concede. So I think, again, what I've explored in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt is that it wasn't just TR. It was this amalgamation, this alchemy of these incredible people in his life who all put their will and energy into one person. Had they lived at a different time, and they had extraordinary lives of their own, had they lived at a different time, they probably would have had their own elected careers. They probably would have had their own professional careers, right? That's the kind of interesting new wrinkle to this story, is that they all put their energy into one person. Ted Jr. would not have necessarily had that same structure of support. And of course, he's living in the shadow of his father, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, he has an extraordinary life, as you point out. He and Theodore Roosevelt are only one of two fathers and sons ever to be awarded the Medal of Honor.
Who is the other one?
I don't know if you want me to give it away, or we can let let me Google that for you. I can tell you, but
yeah, this Arthur and Douglas MacArthur are the other father and son.
You got it. We gave people enough time that they could maybe answer it themselves. But I mean, that's an extraordinary. I also, this is the Realignment podcast. What Ted Jr. didn't see was the realignment of politics. He didn't see the line that exists between the square deal and the New Deal, right? And I think that FDR modeled his entire political career on Theodore Roosevelt. He was governor of New York. He was assistant secretary of the Navy. I mean, he did,
and so was Ted Jr. too. By the way, it's so funny that there was just like a passing. There was a competition during the teens and 20s over the Roosevelt descendants. But I love your point about how what Franklin Roosevelt, who was just incredibly politically astute, I'd say even more politically astute than Theodore Roosevelt, he understood that the realignment of the 1912 election meant that the progressive banner, which Theodore Roosevelt had obviously embodied, shifted to the Democratic Party. And the answer wasn't to create a new party or to try to fight a losing battle on the Republican side. So instead, Alice, who was married to the Speaker of the House, Longworth, if you've been in DC, the Longworth building, Alice and Ted Jr. didn't understand that they actually represented a political dead end for the Republican Party. And once, obviously, the memory of Theodore Roosevelt had dimmed, and then the primary Roosevelt is progressive FDR, obviously the party wouldn't turn to them as part of that. So that's just a fascinating point you made there.
I think they have the women, who obviously outlived Theodore because he dies in 1919, struggle with this, right? Connie, Theodore Roosevelt's younger sister, is the only one who will endorse FDR for governor and then for president. Edith will actually endorse Herbert Hoover over FDR and campaign for him, come out of her private shell and really publicly endorse. I mean, Connie gives a speech. She's the first Republican woman to give a speech at a major party convention in 1920, and then she will endorse FDR in 1932 and previously for governor in 1928. So pretty, it's again, the women in Theodore Roosevelt's life outlived him, and you can understand and see that deepening political divide in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt and the actions that they take in the 20s and early 30s.
Okay, so let's close here. This is a very pessimistic time for the country, especially when it comes to politics. I think any focus on Theodore Roosevelt, I think, is inherently optimistic because it teaches you, not only what human beings are capable of, but there is such thing as the political ability to understand one's moment and one's time and respond to it in ways that previous generations can't. Obviously, we're in this weird generational transition in our political system. Close with just like an optimistic note for why Theodore Roosevelt's story and the story that you tell should be one that younger people who feel pessimistic should be excited by.
One of the most significant realignments in the history of the United States was after the Civil War. And there were 5 presidential elections from 1876 to 1892 where the political parties only really existed to annihilate each other. They didn't excite the population. They didn't there were two popular vote winners who lost the election in those 5 elections. There was one election, 1876, that went to the House of Representatives and was decided by a single electoral vote. There was a non-consecutive president in that series as well. But it was a time of deep division, and then a charismatic leader who put country before party, who understood this shift in society, who was young. I mean, he was 42, the youngest president in American history to this date. Theodore Roosevelt comes to office and he wasn't everyone's hero. He wasn't, everyone, it wasn't universally popular, but he shared a sense of optimism about the future of the country and where we could go if we worked together. And he always thought of the interests of the people. I think if you had to boil Theodore Roosevelt's philosophy down to one word, it would be fair. He wanted a fair deal for everyone. And he thought sometimes he'd have to put his thumb on the scale to even out that fairness. And I think that you can apply that to now, because we're in a realignment. We're in a moment of change. We're in a moment where I think you're going to look back at this period of history and say, oh that made so much sense in retrospect, right? Journalism is the first rough draft of history. What the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt has done is taken another look at history through the lens of our time and a greater appreciation of the people around Theodore Roosevelt. I have a sense, I have a feeling, I have an optimism that once we are through this realignment, we are going to look back on this period as a difficult and challenging time for our country, but something that could produce the democracy of the next 250 years.
That is an excellent place to end the conversation. The book is The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, and I hope everyone checks out the library, the book, and everything we mentioned today. Thank you for joining me on the show, Edward.
Good to be with you, Marshall.